So Kinds of Kindness was directed by Yorgos Lanthimos and it stars Emma Stone, Jesse Plemons, Willem Dafoe, Margaret Qualley, Hong Chow, Joe Alwyn, Mamoto Athey, and Hunter Schafer. And in this movie, it's three stories. Each act is a different story and such. One about a man who's trying to course correct his predetermined path. One whose wife returns home. A man who has his wife return home, but thinks the wife is acting a bit different than when she was before she went missing. And someone else who is trying to find a healer to potentially save their cult. So that's basically the best way I can describe this movie. This movie is wild, but I'll get into that. So this is a movie that I did not know too much about. I knew Yorgos Lanthimos was directing it. He's quickly becoming one of those directors where I kind of am interested no matter what he does. And I'm like, okay, this he's kind of like doing stuff that's like, weird and different and just out there. Last year he just did Poor Things, both with Emma Stone and Willem Dafoe, and I definitely was curious to see like what this movie was like, considering the trailers themselves, while they were engaging, they weren't that long and they didn't really tell you what the movie was about. And watching this movie, for the first two acts, I did enjoy this movie. I thought it was really dark, I thought it was really funny, and I thought it was constantly surprising. But then when you get to the third story, I just felt sad, I just felt depressed a little bit, and I just felt like it was kind of just a sour note to end on. So let's just dive right in. First off, all the actors do a fantastic job. Well, I would say most of the actors do a fantastic job, at least in one story. Jesse Plemons, I think he does a fantastic job in all three storylines. He plays like these wide varieties of characters and such, and he's very good in all three storylines. Willem Dafoe is pretty good in the first and third storyline. Emma Stone's pretty good in the second and the third storyline. Hong Chow, she's really good in the third storyline. Margaret Qualley is really good in the third storyline as well. She has a couple moments in the first storyline as well, so I'll get to. But also Joe Alwyn, I didn't really like him in the first two stories, but the third story I did like him. So I feel like I'm being a hypocrite because I'm saying, well, the actors do a really good job in the third story, but I also feel like the third story is kind of the weakest in terms of like what the subject matter is. Joe Alwyn, I thought he was really creepy in the third story, and I thought he did a really good job and actually had, somewhat of a character. But at least every actor at some point or other does get a chance to shine in one of these stories. I did think the score was also pretty interesting as well, where it's like very minimalist. It's not very complex or anything. But then again, this movie does a lot of the complex stuff for you. The score is very simple. But I'll talk about why I don't love the score overall, because I do think that it would have been better if each storyline had a different score with each storyline. But I'll get into that. Also, the movie is pretty funny. There was times where it's like saying, like watching this movie, and it's like some of the stuff that they say in this movie was just absolutely hilarious, and I kind of wanted to laugh out loud, but I knew there were other people in the theater. It's like I'm just gonna laugh, but I'm not gonna laugh loudly. But it's definitely a very funny and very unpredictable movie. I could not predict where a lot of these stories were gonna go, and I thought it was like, okay, this is very unique, and it's like, okay, I did not expect that kind of ending, but that's definitely interesting. Again, for the most part. And also, it's gorgeously shot. There's a lot of bright colors all over the place. It's just very different, again, because of some of the weird stuff that just happens in this movie and some of the dark stuff that they kind of address in this movie. And I do like with a movie like this where they kind of like have connections between the stories. It's like, okay, how is this story connected to this story, and how is this story connected to this story? And I kind of like seeing some similar themes or like similar moments in each storyline where it's like, oh, okay, there's a moment like this in this story where it's like, oh, there's something else that's similar to that in the other stories. Like at various points, there's stuff about dogs and such, or it's like at one point someone gets slapped in each one. And it's like, okay, I kind of like catching those moments in particular, but the main connection between the storyline is a little underwhelming. Like when you find out like what the main connection is, it's at first intriguing, but then you somewhat realize they don't really do too much with it. It just feels like a very loosely connected piece of a puzzle, and it fits, but at the same time it just doesn't really fit because like it doesn't really matter in the end. I felt like the main connection between all three stories was just very underwhelming, and they didn't really do much with it. And again, some actors are very used very briefly. Mamoto Athey, he was the voice of the main male character in Inside Out, not Inside Out, Elemental. He was just the best friend in each storyline. I thought that was very underwhelming, considering like each actor kind of has like some moments. I felt like he doesn't really get to do too much. I thought he did stand out a little bit in the second one, but even then, it was just mostly the best friend. Joe Alwyn, as I mentioned, he's pretty creepy in the third storyline, but the first two storylines, he just plays various characters who are just barely in the story, no reason whatsoever. Hong Chao, she appears briefly in the first storyline, very brief, even less in the second story. Has a little bit of a character in the third story, probably the most interesting of the three. Margaret Qualley, forgotten in the second act. Hunter Schafer, she actually only appears in the third story, which is kind of weird considering you have all these other actors appearing in all these other stories, and maybe you could have incorporated their character a little bit more in here. But also, I feel like, again, they should have used a few different scores with each storyline. Like, it could have, like, kind of, like, tried to, like, get into the mindset of all these characters and such, and I felt like the score was just kind of just too similar for each story. It's like, I feel like they could have done something a little different with each storyline to kind of show it's like, okay, these are still different characters and such, but again, they try to connect it all together in some way. And also, I've heard a lot of people kind of just walk out of this movie and they were like very split on this movie and they were just out, like, kind of like disturbed. It's like, this movie's pretty weird. Having seen a lot of Yorgos Lanthimos' work before, like The Lobster, Killing the Sacred Deer, and Poor Things and such, honestly, this movie could have been a little weirder. Like, there's a couple weird things in each storyline, which I won't get into. But to me, there was so many moments where I'm like, I was kind of worried going into it. It's like, okay, how weird is this gonna be? I've seen a lot of his stuff, and a lot of people are saying this is really weird and such. I was not that weirded out by this. I honestly felt more uncomfortable during Poor Things and Killing the Sacred Deer than I did in this movie. And also, the third storyline is a bit of a bummer. I won't go into details about it, but it starts off intriguing, but then it just kind of gets a lot more depressing. And I'm like, wow, this can't get any more sad. This can't get any more disturbing. And like, and not in a good way. It just made me feel gross. It just made me feel gross for just sitting there in the last act. And I feel like that's kind of what I kind of take away from it. Whatever you kind of feel like in the end of a movie, that's kind of what you take away from that movie. So it's like if you like the first two acts of a movie, and then the last act kind of underwhelms you, you're gonna think back. It's like, well, that ending, it kind of underwhelmed me. So that's kind of how I feel about this movie. The first two acts were solid. They were pretty fun. They were pretty dark. They were pretty mysterious, and it's like they were overall intriguing. But this one just kind of just left a bad taste afterwards, and I felt like it just pushed a few envelopes where I'm like, you really didn't need to go there. So even though the actors do a fantastic job, the score is very interesting. It's very small in scale, strangely. It is very unpredictable. It is very funny. It is gorgeously shot. And I do like kind of like finding those little puzzle pieces throughout this entire movie. I also felt like the main puzzle piece of this movie just wasn't that interesting. I felt like some actors could have used it a little bit more. It could have been a little weirder. The score could have been a little different at times. And also that third storyline just did not sit right with me while watching it. And even afterwards. I'll give Kinds of Kindness just because the movie itself is pretty weird and just kind of out there, and it is definitely different than a lot of stuff that's out there. I would kind of recommend it. Only if you're like really a big fan of Yorgos Lanthimos' work. If you're intrigued by his work, you're kind of interested in like what he kind of concocts, what it kind of like insanity he kind of concocts next, then this is definitely for you. But if you, again, that third storyline is just, it's going to offend a lot of people. It almost offended me, but it's just, it was a little too far. So I'll give Kinds of Kindness 2.5 out of 4 stars. Stream it. So, what's your favorite anthology movie? Or like your favorite movie with a bunch of different storylines going on? Comment down below, subscribe to the channel. This is Pat. Stay safe.